Staying with Handel, I'm going to talk about two works that he wrote for royal occasions, not the Coronation. They're probably his two most famous pieces apart from Zadok for Priest, and that is the music for the royal fireworks and the water music. The story behind these is great. The water music was written for a planned processional of boats up and down the River Thames, done by George I, and all these musicians had to pile onto this huge barge as they floated down the river and play this music, and the king was absolutely delighted by it and ordered it to be played over and over again. Handel basically built these works on the traditional suite form with French overtures. Very popular at the time. The French overture, you would have a slow, stately introduction followed by a quick allegro section, and then finish up with the stately section returning, and then a series of dances, things like a hornpipe, a minuet, a bourrée, a jig, an air, and these are just absolutely charming pieces. Now, full of good tunes. On record, you can divide between the non-period instrument performances, and then you've got the period instrument performances. And if you go back to earlier performances, they can be a little heavy-handed and slow and not really respect the dance rhythm so much. One exception I'm going to make, there was an arrangement done of both the water music and the fireworks music done by an English composer called Hamilton Harty, and that version was very popular. That's for full orchestra, and there is an absolutely fantastic Mercury Living Presence LP done by Antal Dorati and the London Symphony Orchestra. It's a Mercury Living Presence, wonderful sound. I don't care a fig about the fact that it's not on period instruments because the performance is so musical. Antal Dorati was another of these conductors, like Neville Marriner, Charles Mackerras, Alexander Gibson. Almost impossible to give a bad performance. It's a record to seek out. It's never been reissued. Why is that? It should be reissued by one of these companies like Analog Productions. It wasn't done by Classic Records. It wasn't done by Speaker's Corner. I don't understand it. It's a wonderful record. You can probably find a good copy for not too much money. The first record which really presented this music with an awareness of what was happening in scholarship in terms of rethinking how you performed Baroque music and earlier. This recording came out, and I've talked about this before. This was by the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields, a superb, crack team of London musicians under the direction of Neville Marriner, and they just put out one great record after another on Argo. Later on, they migrated to the Philips label. I think their discography is like one of the biggest discographies there is. What's great about this is it's got that awareness of period style, lighter textures, more sprung rhythms, but it's on modern instruments. And I can recommend this wholeheartedly. We've got here the music for the royal fireworks and essentially a selection from the suites of the water music. The water music exists in many different forms, and different recordings have done different combinations of movements, etc., etc. It's kind of complicated. I won't get into the weeds. I didn't get into the weeds in my article. I'll just say that if you want to get all this music on one record on non-period instruments, this is the one to go for, I really think. When we get to period instrument performances, Oh, you basically got three groups, which were the first out of the gate. You've got Nicholas Harnoncourt out of Germany on Teldec with his early period instrument group, Concentus Musicus Wien. They'd started recording all the Bach cantatas. It was like an absolute mainstay of the early period instrument recording scene. Harnoncourt, how should I put this? Bit of an eccentric. So he loves when you, especially in the fireworks music, where you're getting the old-fashioned brass instruments which don't have valves, so they can only really play certain notes in tune. He delights in just letting them go, and they blow raspberries, they're out of tune. He really doesn't care too much, and it's a wonderful joie de vivre. It wouldn't be my primary recommendation, but his recordings are so much fun. I will stick with the English guys, and on the water music, you've got Christopher Hogwood with the Academy of Ancient Music. Lovely performance. This is a German pressing, direct metal mastered. These are in general often easier to find than the English pressings. Either is good. You get a bit more detail on these direct master recordings, but maybe they're a little cooler in the sound. And then he also did, where we got it here, the music for the Royal Fireworks. Both terrific. But actually, my preference is for the Trevor Pinnock recordings on Deutsche Grammophon, especially this one of the water music. I just love this performance. Now, it's interesting. Hogwood was a real Handel specialist, and he really got Handel. I mean, he's just great. And when I worked with him in Boston, he was the music director of the Handel and Haydn Society, America's oldest continually performing music group, performing on period instruments. Worked with him a ton, recorded everything he did. Would come into the studio, talk, just the most wonderful, erudite, off-the-cuff speaker. But get him onto Handel and his eyes lit up, and you can hear it in his recordings. But I really love this one. This is the one I've been playing the most in recent years. Again, it's early digital, recorded in Henry Wood Hall, I believe. Again, the engineering is great, and I can't recommend this highly enough. Likewise, the fireworks music. Now, the thing with the fireworks music is there is some discussion in musicological circles as to whether the original version is just wind and brass, or whether there are strings. I'm not even sure I know the exact answer to this. Handel really liked to have strings, and this work was written some years after the water music for George I's son, George II. George II was a big military guy, and he was actually the last monarch to lead British troops onto the field of battle, and he didn't have too much truck with anything other than military music. So there is apparently all this great correspondence that went back and forth between Handel and the authorities, where he wanted to have strings present, but they wanted just to have the wind and brass. I'm not sure if it's ever been resolved exactly what happened. So there are recordings which just use brass and wind, and then the recordings, most of the recordings also have string instruments. This is the first of Trevor Pinnock's two recordings that has strings involved as well. He did a later purely CD version, which is just the wind and brass instruments. It's a different kind of sound. I kind of prefer the version with strings as well, and this is just great. A lovely story about that performance. The music was written to be performed before this huge fireworks display, which was going to happen in the centre of London. They built this huge kind of Palladian building to look like a big sort of temple, house, palace, whatever. And within that were the fireworks. Unfortunately, something went wrong and it caught fire, which rather spoiled the fireworks display. The musicians had already played their music, so were out of there, but then this fire took place, so it did rather put a dampener on the evening. Another little bit of minutiae I discovered as I was researching my article, I just love this, was that when Handel was rehearsing his music, again in this French style, very grand, but with these dance movements, he was such a popular composer that people came to listen to the rehearsal in the park, and there was the first recorded traffic jam in London, the first of many, but I love the fact that there was a traffic jam because they were going to go and listen to Handel rehearsing his music. He was that popular. There is a wonderful, more recent recording on CD by this group called Zefiro. They're one of the really great early music groups. Interesting thing about this recording, it was actually recorded outside in what had been a monastery or something like that. So you really get the feeling of this being outside music. If you're looking for a CD version of the Water music, I highly recommend a version that came out a few years ago by the Academy for Alte Musik Berlin. It's on Harmonia Mundi. Everyone raves about this recording. I have it. It's just wonderful. But, it's an alternative to getting one of these older vinyl versions. Now, my article on Trekking Angle talks about a bunch of other records and CDs of other music, but I just wanted to finish off with two works here, which I do discuss in the article, but these are really interesting. And the first of these is by Benjamin Britten, and this is the opera Gloriana he wrote. He was commissioned to write it for the time of the Queen's coronation. It's a full-blown opera that was performed at Covent Garden. Now, at that time, Britten was really the golden boy in British music. His opera, Peter Grimes, had single-handedly put British music back on the map. It had certainly put British opera back on the map, something hadn't happened in years and years. There had been operas by other composers, but none of them sort of gained a grasp on the repertoire like Peter Grimes did, and Peter Grimes is still performed all over the world and still recorded. It's an amazing piece. He followed that up with a series of other operas, some chamber operas, another full-scale opera, Billy Budd, which is my personal favorite of his operas, and a really extraordinary piece and very powerful, as is Peter Grimes. I actually saw probably the most celebrated production of Peter Grimes. It's the one with John Vickers. It was done in the 70s at Covent Garden in this very striking production by Elijah Mushinsky. And up until that time, no one really dared to do Grimes differently or other than Peter Pears, who created the title part. And along comes John Vickers, this really incredible American tenor with a completely different approach. For me, it made more sense as an opera with his performance. It was a very different take on the part, which apparently Britten wasn't so keen on, conducted by Colin Davis. It was a sensational production, and the resulting record, which was put out by Phillips, is also first rate. Anyway, at this time in the early 50s, Britten was the unassailable king of British music and of opera. And so he was commissioned to write this opera for the Queen's coronation, and the Queen was in attendance at that first performance, as were all, the bigwigs in English society, etc., and the piece bombed. It was savaged in the press. Now, he chose as his subject maybe a little controversial. He chose as his subject Elizabeth's great forebear, Elizabeth I, and her doomed romance with the Earl of Essex, which was also immortalized in the Hollywood movie Elizabeth and Essex with Bette Davis. So the opera, I mean, it was savaged, and it really was a huge blow to Britten. I mean, he'd never gotten feedback like that. In this set, which is the only recording of the opera, and it didn't come out until I think it was the 90s, it's done by the Orchestra and Chorus Welsh National Opera, superb opera company, regional opera company, and Sir Charles Mackerras, again, conducting. This whole recording didn't come out until the 90s, nearly 40 years after the first performance, and it's still the only recording. I went back and re-listened to it, and I must say that my admiration for the work really increased enormously. It's, you have to wonder what he thought he was doing to tackle this subject matter. Now, apparently, the Queen liked the piece. That's what we're told. In this set, this is the original issue. There's a really great booklet with the full libretto and really excellent essays by Britten scholars Peter Evans and Donald Mitchell, charting the whole progress of the opera, extracts from Britten's letters as they're fashioning the libretto. Libretto was by William Plomer. Britten always had very, very good librettos for his operas. And they talk about the reception and why it happened. I mean, I think it's very reasonable to make an assumption that, Britten had been the golden boy of English music, and finally his enemies had a chance to rip him a new one, which they did. It really set him back psychologically. It didn't stop him composing or anything like that, but it was a huge shock. He did extract the 4 choral dances as separate concert pieces and pieces to be performed by choirs, but not much mention was made of Gloriana for years and years. Most of Britten's operas really are a study of an individual in conflict with the rest of society, or at least separated from the rest of society. And you could definitely see in here that he's exploring those ideas with the monarch, how she has to not have relationships, she has to keep herself to herself. And in many ways, this work anticipates The Crown, because this is what that TV series explores so well, this idea of the individual who becomes the monarch being trapped within the institution and the weight of the crown, something that Shakespeare explored extensively in his plays, and he referred to the hollow crown, and there's a cycle of the history plays which are given an often under that blanket title, The Hollow Crown. I think the BBC did a series of dramatizations like that, and it's really true. If you watch The Crown, a lot of which, at least until the last season, was pretty close to the historical facts. Obviously, there's a lot of creative license, but the main tenet of it is pretty accurate. It's all about these people being trapped. They can't marry who they want to marry. They can't be in relationships with the people they want to be in relationships with, and this just the extent to which relationships within the royal family suffered as a result of the institution. That has been slowly changing. The fact that Charles was able to remarry a divorced woman, the Queen actually had to pass a law to achieve that. But those themes are being explored in here, and the music is first rate. It really is first rate. I've never seen this opera staged. I now really want to see it. There is a really good video version on YouTube directed by David McVicker, who's one of the best of the opera directors around these days. I saw an amazing Carmen he did at Glyndebourne many years ago with my daughter. It was her first opera. So anyway, it's an underrated piece and needs to be reassessed. Is it on the same level as Grimes, Bud, Turn of the Screw, even A Midsummer Night's Dream. I don't think it's on that level, but it's a really fine piece. This recording is very good. Josephine Barstow, who plays the Queen, her voice is a little strident and shrieky. I wish maybe they'd had someone different for that. But it certainly doesn't get in the way of enjoying the opera. I'm going to finish up with an unusual favorite of mine. And this is music by Michael Tippett. And if you know anything about Michael Tippett, I mean, it's so odd that he was commissioned to write this piece, the suite for the birthday of Prince Charles, after the heir apparent was born. Now, Michael Tippett, he was a bit older than Britten, and he and Britten really were the generation after William Wharton. And even though they continued to write in a tonal style while the rest of the world, most of it, was turning to atonality, serial music, all of that stuff, how that has changed. Tippett and Britten remained in the tonal idiom. But Tippett was, what an interesting guy. He really struggled at composition. It was really hard work for him. He identified strongly with Beethoven. You know, Beethoven struggled, had all his notebooks where he worked out his themes. You know, it didn't come naturally to Beethoven like it did for Mozart. Well, likewise Tippett. I mean, Britten could just write music, you know, anytime, anywhere. It was just flowing out of him from when he was a kid. I remember playing one of his piano pieces when I was a kid that he'd written when he was about 10. And it's superb. You know, just the assurance of it. No, Tippett struggled. But he is a composer who I think is terribly underrated since he died. And he really needs to be rediscovered. And there are signs that that is happening. There's just been a really good new recording of his opera, Midsummer Marriage. His most popular period of music is sort of his middle period, which encompasses works like A Midsummer Marriage and the first, second symphonies. He was also very fond of Stravinsky, so a lot of his music's got that very Stravinsky-esque sort of bite and rhythmic drive. But he's got this wonderful lyrical side to him too, and there's an incredible record, if you can find it, on Argo, of Neville Marriner with the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields doing a selection of Tippett's string music, which is absolutely glorious. But this work that he wrote for the Prince Charles is just utterly enchanting. It is based on, Tippett had a great passion for early music and for folk music, like many British composers, and he works in these melodies into these different movements. You've got an entrada, berceuse, procession and dance, carol, finale. It is utterly charming. This is my favourite recording, done by Colin Davis and the London Symphony. Colin Davis was the great champion of Tippett's music, both live and in the recording studio. And this is Philip's recording and the heyday of its analogue, sort of the mid to late 70s, where these records could sound absolutely lovely. Now there's another recording, this one here, done by Georg Solti with the Chicago Symphony. Solti was entrusted with recording first performance, I think they commissioned it, first performance and recording of the Fourth Symphony. Difficult work. Not one of Tippett's most popular, not necessarily one of his most successful, but it's got incredible stuff in it. This recording of the suite for Prince Charles, again, it's typical Solti and it's Chicago Symphony. It's a sharper-edged performance, brass, wind, all very, very well delineated, but it lacks the charm of this and the analog warmth. This is an absolutely lovely piece and a great place to begin your exploration of Tippett's music. And I just find it so funny that of all people, he was the one commissioned to write this piece for the child who is now going to become king. So in a way, we've come full circle. And in case you're wondering about this record up here, this is one of the first records, or very early record that I bought. It's of all this kind of British music, things like Land of Hope and Glory, Royal Britannia, recorded by a very young Andrew Davis, probably his first records as a conductor, and recorded in the Royal Albert Hall. And this came out on a bargain label called Music for Pleasure. And John Boyden, who was the producer of these records, he did a whole series of these really good records of classical music, but it was on new recordings on a budget label, but very well engineered. He went on to start his own record label called Enigma, which has some wonderful stuff on it. Anyway, I just put this up here because it's a really fun record. You're never going to see it in the bins in America, that's for sure. But I just thought it'd be fun to have up there. So there we go. This has just been a quick survey of some of the records I talked about in my 2 articles for Trekking Angle. Royal music for the coronation, for ceremonials, occasional occasions. There is wonderful music here, and it's a great way to sort of get into a certain period of British music. I mean, most people are familiar with the Handel works, but not so familiar maybe with Elgar, Walton, and certainly Tippett. Britten they're more familiar with. But this is very accessible repertoire. It's first-rate music, and all these records I've shown are first-rate recordings. So once you finish with the coronation, if you want to explore some of the music you're going to hear there, seek out some of these records. They're really, really fine. Anyway, until the next time, the next video, happy listening and good night.